They found the file where bread should have risen. "Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Tell me your city. I value your voices." Wolfe follows the crumbs. You can call it intuition, or maybe just survival instinct, but when Fritz brings in a visitor before lunch, I start looking for an excuse to step outside. That's because Nero Wolfe hates uninvited company about as much as he hates diluted beer, and my job description includes absorbing the fallout when both appear at once. It was a Tuesday morning, and the brownstone was enjoying what Mr. Wolfe calls its normal serenity, meaning he was reading Plutarch, and I was pretending to sort mail while actually timing how long it would take Fritz to announce lunch. Then came the knock. Fritz entered, solemn as a cathedral bell. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "a lady wishes to see Mr. Wolfe. She insists it concerns, how did she put it? A domestic outrage." "Domestic outrage?" I repeated. "Did she mention if it involves broken hearts or broken furniture?" Fritz frowned, which meant he didn't approve of my tone. He rarely does. "She said it concerns the kitchen." Now, that got my attention. Fritz Brenner treats the kitchen like a chapel, and Nero Wolfe treats Fritz like an apostle. Any threat to that setup would rank as blasphemy in our household. I glanced at Wolfe. He didn't look up from Plutarch. "Send her away," he murmured. Fritz hesitated. "She was quite agitated, sir. She mentioned—" He paused delicately. "The flower." Wolfe's eyes lifted, slow and deliberate. "The flower?" "Yes, sir." Wolfe closed his book and gave me the kind of look that usually precedes an instruction I'll regret. "Archie, bring her in." I did, and in walked a woman who looked like she could slice onions with her posture alone. Late 30s, neat as a pressed tablecloth, with the kind of focus in her eyes that made me wish I'd shaved. "Mr. Wolfe," she said crisply, "I'm Mrs. Laura Drummond. I'm head of the Culinary Council of New York." That, I'll admit, meant something even to me. Fritz had mentioned the council a few times, mostly when they'd snubbed his superior recipes in favor of something called progressive gastronomy, which sounded like treason. Wolfe inclined his head a fraction. "Indeed. I'm familiar with your organization. What offense brings you here?" She exhaled as if gathering herself. "Something was stolen from me this morning. Or rather, tampered with." "Then you should call the police," I said, because Wolfe didn't. She ignored me. "It happened in your own domain, Mr. Wolfe. Your chef's supplier, the Martian Bakery. I was there early for a council inspection. Someone broke into their storage and replaced a file with flour." Wolfe blinked once. "A file? A confidential one, containing recipes, contracts, and endorsements. The sabotage was discovered when a bag was moved and split open. The file was inside. Flour everywhere. A deliberate humiliation. I could see it. The great Nero Wolfe's sanctum invaded by culinary intrigue. The man had investigated murders, extortions, disappearances, but flour. Still, there was a certain insult to it that would itch under his skin. "And why?" Wolfe asked quietly. "Do you bring this to me?" She hesitated. "Because one of my council members claims you were the inspiration for it, that it's a jab at your domestic empire." That got his full attention. Wolfe's eyes narrowed, his chin tucked. "Nonsense," he said, but his tone had cooled several degrees. I leaned back in my chair. This was getting interesting. "Who's the comedian making that claim?" "Mr. Leonard Kearns," she said, "owner of Kearns Fine Foods. He said—" She hesitated again. "He said Nero Wolfe's kitchen was overdue for a scandal." That did it. Wolfe sat forward an inch, an earthquake in our geography. "Phooey," he said softly. "Archie, take Mrs. Drummond's particulars. We shall consider whether to defend the brownstone's honor or let it rot under the slander of a fool." Mrs. Drummond's eyes flashed with something between gratitude and relief. Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. I'll await your decision. But I warn you, this is no joke. Someone is playing with reputations, and yours is next. When she left, the room felt heavier. I looked at Wolfe. Are we really going to chase a missing file through a flower bin? He closed his eyes. Archie, when a man's kitchen is mocked, it is an act of war. See to it that we win. Fritz didn't let the door finish closing behind Mrs. Drummond before he cleared his throat at me in a tone that would have made a bishop apologize. I knew that tone. It meant the kitchen had been mentioned in vain and restitution was required in this lifetime. I gave him palms out. I'm only the errand boy, Fritz. Complain to the bishop. He darted a glance at Wolfe, who had resettled in the red leather with his book unopened and his eyelids half down as if the world had dimmed the lights without asking him. Archie, Wolfe said, telephone Mr. Marchand, then Mr. Kearns, the former for facts, the latter for his insolence. Invite them at 4. Include Mrs. Drummond if she can manage it. I got Marchand first. His voice had the cracked sheen of a man who considers sleep an immigrant. The gist, before dawn, a storage room door at the bakery had shown tool marks. No one had noticed till 9. Inside, an archive box that should have held council papers instead coughed flour when a clerk hefted it. Marchand swore nobody from his side knew the contents of the box. He wasn't supposed to. He also swore that if the council dragged his name into a scandal, he'd close for a week and let the city eat cake from the 5 and dime. I promised him a civilized chair at 4 o'clock and hung up to earn my pay with Kearns. Kearns answered from somewhere with background laughter that could have been customers, or mirrors. He was affable in the boisterous way of men who always stand too close to their own reflections. Nero Wolfe wants to see me? Tell him to bring his appetite, he said. I told him Wolfe's appetite traveled by appointment only. When I added that Mrs. Drummond would be present, he chuckled. Good. Maybe she'll finally season a sentence. He accepted 4 o'clock with a relish that would have stained a napkin. When I relayed the results, Wolfe grunted. 1 syllable, translation. Adequate. He extended a finger as if pressing a concealed button and set the household machinery in motion. Fritz, the office. Beer at 4:20. No comestibles. We are not a salon. Fritz bowed and retreated, but came snapping back 3 minutes later in a state of condensed outrage. There is a sack on the stoop, he announced, as if the building had developed a goiter. A 50-pound sack of flour. I didn't believe him until I looked. There it sat against the brass boot scraper, a burlap sack with a pasted label. It had been handled generously. A flowery ghost had shaken hands with our steps. The label claimed provenance from Kearns' Fine Foods and recommended itself to the world with exclamation marks. Fritz made a small sound that didn't belong to any healthful emotion. I said, I suppose the milkman couldn't carry it any farther. Wolfe didn't bother to come see. He hates the front hall even on its good days. Bring it in, he called, but not to the kitchen. My office, and mind the carpet. I got a tarpaulin from the basement and muscled the sack onto it. Even hauled, the thing had too much personality for a mere sack. Inside, the weight shifted like a cat reconsidering its nap. When I plunked it beside Wolfe's desk and dusted off my cuffs, he studied the label the way he studies people. Once. Open it, he told me. Here. On the top, have a brush ready. Fritz produced a brush with the air of a man who would afterward need a shower in bleach. I cut the twine. The mouth of the sack yawned and sent up a white breath. The first few handfuls were honest flour, fine, clean, and innocent. 6 inches below, my fingers knocked on paper. I dug out a rectangle, wrapped tight in brown butcher paper and twine, the size of a serious book. Somebody had done craft hour. I didn't unwrap it. I looked at Wolfe. He looked at me. If his expression had moved, a seismograph wouldn't have noticed. Set it there, he said, indicating the blotter. Use the brush." The twine came free and the paper peeled back to show a manila folder with a grease pencil scrawl, block printing, council, contract. I didn't open that either. If the next act in the vaudeville was a white cloud over the desk and 50 pages of labeled confetti, it wasn't going to be my performance. "Somebody," I said, "likes symbolism." "Somebody," Wolfe corrected, "likes theater and expects me to be an audience." He kept his hands on the chair arms, but they had tightened. "Fritz, you will not use this flower. Put it in the cellar. Archie, call the elevator. We will show Mr. Kearns his advertisement." It was noon, and the brownstone already felt like a public building with a doorman who wasn't being paid enough. I carried the sack to the cellar and came back to find Wolfe regarding the folder as if it were a wasp that didn't know enough to stay outdoors. "Do I peek?" I asked. "You do not," he said. "We will let them see it unopened, so each may wonder how much I do not yet know." "Nice," I said. "We don't know either." "We know enough," he said, and finally leaned forward to press a button on the intercom. "Fritz, luncheon." Lunch restored some of the world's natural order. The corned beef had opinions, the cabbage behaved itself, and Wolfe condescended to eat. He did it largely in silence. When he speaks less at the table than the cutlery, you can be sure his mind is building scaffolding for something that will hang men with their own words. At 3:57, the bells started our parade. Mrs. Drummond first, ironed to perfection and carrying a calm that had to be pinned. Behind her, Martian with flour still ghosting the cuffs of his jacket, and after him, right on cue, Leonard Kearns wearing a tie that looked like it had been selected by committee and a grin that hadn't. Fritz ushered them in with a dignity that could have slapped and didn't. Wolfe didn't rise. He never does for parades. He granted each a measured nod, then shifted his gaze to the sack, the top, and the manila folder on his blotter like three props in a discourteous play. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "someone has attempted to make my house a stage. I deplore drama, therefore we will confine ourselves to facts." He inclined his head at me. "Archie, tell them what was left at my door." I did, and watched the air in the room tighten. Mrs. Drummond's lips thinned, Marchand's eyes flared, and Kearns's grin slipped and then clamped back on like it had been trained. He said, too easily, "My compliments to your delivery service, Mr. Wolfe. It's not mine." "Pfui," Wolfe murmured. "Presently we will test your denials. Meanwhile, we will establish who benefits from the suggestion that I am embroiled." He set his hands together and, without moving more than his tongue, took possession of the room. The brownstone was disturbed, yes, but the geography hadn't changed. They had come into his jungle, and he would choose who left with bite marks. Kearns' grin held just a second too long. I'd seen men hold that same expression in courtrooms right before the jury foreman said the word guilty. He shifted his weight, studied the sack as if it might explain itself, then shrugged. "I've been blamed for worse advertising stunts, Mr. Wolfe, but this one isn't mine. My flower shipments don't travel alone, and they sure as hell don't carry paperwork." Mrs. Drummond looked ready to turn him into pastry dough. "You were the one," she said, "who told me last week that my counsel was ripe for exposure. You meant this, didn't you? You've been hinting about sabotage for months." Kearns lifted both hands. "Lady, I talk plenty, but I don't haul 50 pounds of flour up brownstone steps. I don't even climb mine." "Enough," Wolfe said. The single syllable carried more weight than the sack beside his desk. He let the silence ferment until even the radiator stopped clanking. "This theater," he continued, "depends on appearances. A file replaced with flour, a similar sack deposited here. I infer design, not coincidence." He turned his gaze on Marchand, whose fingers worried at his hat brim. "You, sir, were entrusted with storage." Marchand swallowed. "I didn't touch that file, Mr. Wolfe. We keep hundreds of boxes in a locked storeroom. Somebody used a skeleton key. I've already replaced the locks." Wolfe's eyelids drooped. Locks are for honest men. Tell me, who at your bakery has routine access? 4 of us. Myself, 2 clerks, and the night guard. Names, Wolfe said. Frankie Dean, clerk. Miss Betty Ralston, the other clerk. Guard's name is Joseph Prentice. I jotted them in my notebook. I'd heard of none of them, but that's the charm of bakeries. They keep their secrets in the dough. Wolfe continued, have any of them ties to the Culinary Council? Marchand hesitated. Miss Ralston, she sometimes assists Mrs. Drummond at council luncheons. They're friendly. Mrs. Drummond stiffened. Friendly, yes. I hardly think Betty. She could have taken the file while pretending to tidy your materials, Wolfe interrupted smoothly. Do not defend or accuse. We are establishing pattern, not guilt. Kearns chuckled, low. Pattern, huh? Maybe the pattern's that everyone wants a taste of your reputation, Wolfe. You make enemies easy. That earned him a look so level I thought it might melt the man's starch. You mistake my serenity for accessibility, Mr. Kearns. I'm not a man who makes enemies. I acquire nuisances. Fritz, from the doorway, made the smallest approving sound I've ever heard from a man carrying a tray. Wolfe motioned for him to place it on the side table, a simple pitcher of water and glasses. No beer. The gesture was deliberate. Wolfe was keeping himself sober for slaughter. Archie, he said, note times and statements. We shall require them. Then to the room. Someone here orchestrated an embarrassment. Its elegance lies in its restraint. Flour, not fire. The aim was ridicule, not ruin, which tells me the culprit has wit but limited courage. Kearns's grin twitched. Mrs. Drummond inhaled sharply. Marchand fumbled with his hat again. Wolfe allowed the tremor of silence to spread, then said, That will suffice for now. I shall think. He closed his eyes, which was his way of dismissing everyone but gravity. I escorted our trio to the door, maintaining the kind of cheerful neutrality that keeps fists unthrown. On the stoop, Kearns paused to light a cigar. You know, Goodwin, your boss is good theater, but this is kitchen gossip, not crime. You'll see. Maybe, I said. But I've seen gossip kill reputations faster than bullets kill men. Mrs. Drummond gave him a glare that would have sterilized instruments. If you had nothing to do with this, Mr. Kearns, then I suggest you help Mr. Wolfe uncover who did, before we assume your fingerprints are on every grain. She swept off toward a waiting cab. Marchand followed, more subdued. Kearns grinned smoke and sauntered away, leaving me with the scent of arrogance and cigars. Back upstairs, Wolfe was in full chrysalis mode, eyes closed, fingers steepled. I waited until he spoke. Archie, tomorrow you will visit Marchand's bakery, speak with the clerks and the guard. Observe, do not interrogate. Sure, I said. What am I looking for? People with flour on their conscience. Perhaps, or someone who found humor in contamination. A jest executed well requires an audience. Find who enjoyed it most. That was my cue to head out, but Fritz appeared in the doorway again, agitated. There was a note under the tarp, he said. I discovered it while cleaning. Wolfe opened his eyes. Bring it. Fritz handed over a scrap folded twice, speckled with white dust. Wolfe unfolded it delicately. The handwriting was slanted, deliberate, written in pencil. Even gods can choke on flour. I whistled. Well, that's poetic. So our joker's got a flair for metaphors. Wolfe didn't move. Indeed, and the arrogance to address me as deity. Imbecile. He pressed the paper flat. Keep it sealed, Archie. I will have it examined later. I slipped it into an envelope. So, we've got a disappearing file, a reappearing sack, and an anonymous poet who likes his victims ironic. You think it's about the council or about you? Both, Wolfe murmured. An attack on one's kitchen is an attack on one's competence, and competence is what defines us to the world. Whoever planned this wants me unsettled. I grinned. Then they've never seen you during beer rationing. He gave me a look that could have been mistaken for amusement if you'd had a magnifying glass. Go about your work, Archie. Return before dinner. We must anticipate their next move. I left him there, an immovable fortress in a room that felt suddenly smaller, the faint scent of flour still in the air. Outside, Manhattan was stirring to its afternoon pulse, but for once I didn't feel like part of the rhythm. Someone had taken a swing at Nero Wolfe, not with fists, but with subtlety, and I had a feeling the dust wouldn't settle easily. The next morning began with the kind of quiet that usually precedes discovery. Fritz was in the kitchen, clattering softly. His way of telling me the previous day's intrusion hadn't been forgiven, and Wolfe was already upstairs among the orchids, making his daily pilgrimage to the plant rooms. That meant I had 2 hours of relative freedom before the great man descended and began dispensing orders like a benevolent tyrant. I used the time to review my notes. Marchand's employees, Frankie Dean, Betty Ralston, and the night guard Prentice, were a promising trio. Betty's connection to Mrs. Drummond made her the likeliest bridge between the council and the bakery, and that made her first on my list. By 10 o'clock, I was walking into Marchand Bakery. The air inside had the kind of sweetness that could knock the edge off a bad conscience. Rows of glass cases glittered with pastries, and a short man with a mustache like a frightened squirrel was overseeing the cash register. When I introduced myself, he nodded toward the back. "Office," he said, not thrilled. Marchand's office was barely big enough for him and his paperwork. He looked worse than yesterday, more flour on his sleeves and less hope in his eyes. "I told you everything I knew," he said before I'd even closed the door. "I know. I'm not here to rehash it. Just need to talk to your clerks and the guard. Routine." He hesitated, then buzzed for someone. Betty Ralston appeared a minute later. She was 30-ish, pleasant, with the kind of neatness that comes from either pride or paranoia. Her eyes flicked to my notebook like it might bite. "You're from Nero Wolfe's office?" she asked. "That's right. Don't worry. We're not the police. We just ask smarter questions." That got me a small smile. "Then ask away. Tell me about the morning the file went missing." She folded her arms. "I came in around 8. The storeroom was locked, same as usual. Frankie went to get sugar for the front counter and found the box open. Flour everywhere. Mr. Marchand called the council right after." "You touched the box?" "No. I saw enough mess from the doorway. I don't like getting dirty." That fit. Her hands were spotless, nails trimmed and clear, but her eyes slid just slightly to the left when she said it, which meant she was hiding something. I said casually, "You know Mrs. Drummond?" "I assist her sometimes," she admitted. "She's particular. Likes things done her way." "Did she trust you with council documents?" "Of course not." She smiled again, thinner this time. She barely trusts herself. "Anyone else from the council visit here recently?" "No one. Not even Kearns?" That got me a pause. Just a breath, but enough. "He came once," she said. "Last week. Said he was looking for a supplier quote. He stayed maybe 5 minutes." "And what did he talk about?" "Flour." She gave a nervous laugh. "What else?" I thanked her and asked for Frankie next. He was a tall, sandy-haired kid who looked like life hadn't quite explained itself to him yet. He slouched in the doorway, rubbing his hands on his apron. "I didn't take nothing," he said before I'd opened my mouth. "Fine," I said. "Let's talk about what you did take." He blinked. "Sugar. Just sugar." He was jumpy but honest in the way of people too simple to invent a lie quickly. He'd seen the mess first, called Betty, and that was about it. When I asked if he knew Prentice, the night guard, he shrugged. "He's quiet, reads a lot, sometimes brings pastries home." "What kind of reading?" "Books with fancy covers." Poems, I think. That rang a small bell. Wolfe's note, the poetic one. I made a mental underline and left Frankie to his duties. Prentice, it turned out, was off shift until nightfall, but the doorman at the back entrance gave me his address. A modest walk-up on 47th. I headed there next, the morning crowd still thick enough to hide a conscience or two. Prentice answered his door wearing a clean shirt and the look of a man who'd seen suspicion before. His apartment was tidy, books stacked everywhere, mostly poetry, as advertised. "Mind if I ask about your night watch?" I said. "Ask." "Notice anyone near the storeroom? Unusual sounds?" "No one. Quiet as usual." "You lock up yourself?" "Every night. Same routine for 8 years." I walked slowly, scanning the room. On his desk, a half-empty mug sat beside a notebook filled with pencil scrawl. I could make out one line before he noticed me looking. "Dust is honest, men are not." "You right?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Only what I can't say aloud." That wasn't proof, but it was something. Too poetic by half and too coincidental. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair, surrounded by the comfort of order and orchids. He didn't ask if I'd found anything. He asked, "Who is the poet?" "Name's Joseph Prentice," I said. "Your flower poet has a library card." "Describe him." "Educated, restrained, and nervous. Keeps verse on his nightstand. Works nights in a bakery. Couldn't tell if he's shy or guilty." "Both, perhaps," Wolfe murmured. "Did he have opportunity?" "Plenty. He locks the place up alone. But motive? Not unless he's got something against the Culinary Council or you." "Or both," Wolfe said softly. "The note at our door suggests mockery aimed at me. But the original substitution, the file for flower, was designed to humiliate the council. We are looking at a performance with 2 acts. The author of the first may not have written the second." I nodded. "So, someone starts the joke, and someone else decides to finish it, using your name for effect." "Precisely, and that complicates matters. It suggests cooperation or exploitation." "Maybe Prentice replaced the file as a prank," I said. "Then somebody higher up, say Kearns, used it to smear you." "That presumes Kearns is clever enough to recognize poetry," Wolfe said. "I doubt it." The doorbell rang then, abrupt as punctuation. Fritz went to answer. Moments later, he returned with a small brown envelope. "Delivered by hand," he said. Wolfe opened it with the letter opener, unfolded the single sheet, and read aloud, "The next sack won't be flour." For the first time since the case began, he exhaled through his nose. Sharp, cold. "Archie," he said quietly, "someone is escalating. We must be ready for substance instead of symbolism." I felt the weight of it, that shift from mockery to menace. The brownstone wasn't just disturbed now, it was under siege. Wolfe didn't speak for a full minute after reading that note. He held it between thumb and forefinger like something alive, a faint crease at his brow, the only visible sign that the fortress walls had felt a tremor. When he finally laid the paper flat on the desk blotter, he said in that deep, unhurried tone that could peel bark from a tree, "Archie, this is not the work of a prankster. The progression is deliberate. We have moved from jest to threat." "Yeah," I said, taking the note with a tissue. "And whoever delivered this wasn't shy about it. Fritz said it came by hand, no stamp, no courier tag. Meaning our friend's been close enough to ring the bell twice now." He closed his eyes briefly. "We shall determine whether that familiarity is confidence or desperation. Either is dangerous." He leaned back, the chair groaning softly. "Fetch Saul Panzer. I want him here within the hour." That was Wolfe's version of declaring a national emergency. When Saul gets called in, it means the situation has stepped out of the parlor and into the alley. I phoned him, and by the time Fritz announced lunch, veal and eggplant, impeccable as always. Saul was at the door, his fedora tilted at that angle that made him look like he already knew the ending. Wolfe explained the essentials without embroidery: the missing file, the flower delivery, the poetic notes, and the warning. Saul listened with the same attention he'd give to a safe he was about to open. "I'll start at Marchand's," he said when Wolfe finished. "Discreetly. You want me watching the guard?" "Watch all of them," Wolfe said, "but especially anyone who seems too eager to explain. Men who manufacture alibis are often confessing without knowing it." Saul nodded once and left. That freed me to enjoy lunch, though I'll admit it didn't taste as fine with that note lying face up like an unpaid bill. Wolfe ate in silence. Afterward, he stayed in his chair, eyes half-lidded, the way he does when he's talking to himself inside his skull. I knew better than to interrupt. At 4, Saul phoned from a pay booth on 10th Avenue. "Prentice isn't at his place," he said. "Didn't show for his shift last night either. Marchand says no call, no sign of him since yesterday afternoon." "That's inconvenient," I said. "You check hospitals?" "Already did." "Nothing yet. I'll keep looking." "Oh, and a guy in a grey delivery truck was parked outside the bakery at 5 this morning. No logo, no plates. Took off before anyone could ask questions." When I relayed that to Wolfe, his reaction was minimal but telling. A slow arch of the brow. A man vanishes, and an anonymous vehicle attends the scene. The pieces accumulate. He pressed the intercom button. "Fritz, bring the envelope again." When it arrived, he studied the second note beside the first. "The first mocked me. The second warns me. The next may challenge me. I do not intend to grant that opportunity." "Meaning what?" I asked. "Meaning we must provoke rather than await." That was my cue to prepare for an errand that probably involved baiting someone who didn't like us much. "Who do I provoke?" "Kearns," he said simply. "He is loud, careless, and confident. Such men are useful pawns whether they know it or not." So I went to Kearns' Fine Foods, where the aroma of truffle oil fought a losing battle against the smell of ego. Kearns was behind the counter talking to a reporter from some culinary weekly, explaining how innovation required courage and other platitudes. When he spotted me, his grin came back like a reflex. "Goodwin, how's the Oracle of West 35th Street?" "He's fine," I said. "But his patience isn't. Someone's been trespassing on it, and your name keeps popping up like yeast." He laughed too loudly. "Still chasing flower ghosts? Look, if somebody's got it in for Wolfe, it isn't me. I respect the man. I just don't worship him like the rest of you." "Then why send sacks with your company label?" "Because it's free advertising," he shot back. "Or maybe because someone wants you to think it's me. You ever consider that?" "Sure," I said. "We consider everything, but if you're innocent, you might want to start helping instead of joking." That hit a nerve. His grin faltered. "Fine. You want something? One of my warehouse boys mentioned seeing a woman near the bakery a few nights ago. Short coat, scarf, waited till the guard left for his rounds. He thought she looked familiar. Said she could have been Betty Ralston, but he wasn't sure." "Betty," I said, keeping my voice even. "You tell the police?" "Not my job," he said. "But maybe yours." I thanked him and left before he could add another wisecrack. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was still in his chair, hands folded, the eyes glimmering faintly with that detached satisfaction that means he's starting to see the shape under the fog. I told him about Kearns' story. He nodded. "Ah. So Miss Ralston, who dislikes dirt, was seen lingering near a place where she might acquire it. How enterprising. You think she planted the file?" "Perhaps, but Prentice's disappearance complicates the narrative. It suggests a partnership that has dissolved." "You mean one of them turned on the other?" "Or silenced the other," Wolfe said. "Prentice may have written the first note, but I suspect the second belongs to different hands. The style differs, the rhythm is gone, the wit evaporated. A new author has taken the stage. He reached for the beer Fritz had finally brought. Archie, tomorrow you will bring Miss Ralston here. Use whatever pretext you find convincing. I wish to observe her response when confronted with her own reflection. You expecting fireworks? No? Something quieter and more telling. A flinch, perhaps. He sipped the beer, eyes closing briefly. We are close, Archie. The flower was never the substance. It was the disguise. Someone hid truth inside a jest, and now I intend to sift it out. Outside, dusk settled over the city, pressing against the brownstone's windows like a held breath. Inside, Wolfe sat immovable, a man considering which piece to move next on a board only he could see. The game had shifted. Our unknown adversary had promised escalation, and I could tell from Wolfe's expression that he was already planning to meet it. Not with fear, but with precision sharp enough to cut through the dust. The next morning I found Wolfe already in the office, which was as rare as a vegetarian in a steakhouse. He was seated, of course. He never stands before breakfast, but the evidence of movement was there. His copy of the Times folded neatly beside the phone, his orchid schedule pushed half an inch out of alignment. That meant his mind had been pacing since dawn. He didn't look up as I entered. Archie, he said, have you arranged Miss Ralston's visit? Set for 11, I said. She thinks you want to recommend her for a culinary award. I figured flattery would get her through the door faster than suspicion. Commendable, he said. Fritz will ensure she receives no coffee until I permit it. I want her nerves taut, not soothed. Good strategy, I said. If this keeps up, you'll be giving lessons in psychological warfare. He allowed a small grunt, Wolfe's equivalent of a smirk. Psychology is merely logic applied to deceit. Now, when she arrives, I want you seated opposite her. Do not question her. Watch her. Every twitch, every hesitation. That was my specialty. I'd once told him I could tell a liar by how they held a teacup. He'd called that nonsense, but I'd noticed he'd never stopped watching teacups after that. At 11 sharp, Fritz ushered Betty Ralston into the office. She wore the same tidy suit from the bakery, though the polish had worn thin overnight. Her eyes darted around the room as though the bookshelves might be cross-examining her. Miss Ralston, Wolfe said, inclining his head. Thank you for coming. She perched on the edge of the red chair, hands folded. Mr. Goodwin said this was about an award. I watched Wolfe's mouth curve, not quite a smile. Yes, the award of my confidence, which you will either win or lose in the next few minutes. Her breath caught. I don't understand. Few do at first. He gestured lazily toward the desk, where the manila folder sat, still wrapped in the brown paper. That, Miss Ralston, was found in a sack of flour left at my door. It originated at Marchand's bakery. You were one of 4 people with access to it. She went pale enough to make the walls jealous. I didn't, Mr. Wolfe. I had nothing to do with that. I swear it. Swearing, he said mildly, is an exercise in wasted breath, unless accompanied by reason. Tell me, when did you last see the file? Monday. I was helping Mrs. Drummond sort council materials before the inspection. And after the inspection? I returned everything to the boxes myself. Yet by dawn, the file was gone. And shortly afterward, someone left me this. He reached into the drawer and slid the first note across the desk. Even gods can choke on flour. Her eyes widened. She didn't touch it, just stared as if it were contagious. That's horrible. But why would anyone... Wolfe interrupted softly. Because ridicule is power. Tell me, Miss Ralston, were you ever ridiculed? She blinked, unsure whether it was a question or an accusation. I don't think so. Then allow me to rephrase. Were you ever dismissed, overlooked, underestimated? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Mrs. Drummond doesn't give much credit. Ah. Wolfe leaned back, eyes half closed. And Leonard Cairns. Her head snapped up. Him? I met him once. He's arrogant. He flirted. I ignored him. Archie Goodwin, professional observer, noted the tremor in her hands. Not fear, anger, deep and practiced. Wolfe opened his eyes fully. Very well. One last question. Did you know Joseph Prentice? Her lips parted, then closed again. Yes. He works nights. He's quiet. We talked sometimes. When did you last see him? Tuesday evening. She hesitated. He walked me to the subway after work. And since then? Nothing. He hasn't answered his phone. I thought he might be sick. Wolfe's voice dropped an octave. He may be more than that. She looked from him to me, realization dawning like a slow bruise. You think he's dead? I think, Wolfe said, he is missing, which is sometimes a prelude. You were his friend. You exchanged confidences. What did he tell you? She swallowed. Only that he hated being invisible. He said he wrote poems so someone would remember his name. Wolfe nodded slightly, satisfied. That will be all for now, Miss Ralston. She started to protest, but he lifted a hand, and the discussion ended. Fritz escorted her out, leaving a faint trace of perfume and panic behind. When the door shut, Wolfe exhaled. Archie. She's involved. Yeah, I said. You could practically see it sweating out of her. She is complicit, but not criminally ambitious, he continued. Her distress was genuine. She may have assisted, willingly or not, in Prentice's scheme, but the escalation was beyond her. You mean the second note? Precisely. Someone else took over once Prentice disappeared. I tapped my notebook. Then we've got 3 levels. Prentice starts the mockery. Ralston helps or covers for him. Then Kearns, or someone using his name, decides to up the ante. He nodded once. And that person has both access and malice. Kearns fits the temperament, though not the intellect. Still, the possibility amuses me. Before I could reply, the phone rang. I picked it up. Goodwin. It was Saul Panzer. His voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it. Archie, you'd better tell Wolfe. They found Prentice. Where? 'Tis in the East River, last night. Police just pulled him out. For a moment, silence filled the room. Wolfe's face didn't move, but his eyes did. A flicker of cold comprehension. Was it accident? I asked. Saul's answer was short. No, head wound, body weighted down. Somebody wanted him quiet. I hung up slowly. Wolfe closed his eyes, the faintest tremor in his jaw. So the jest has become murder, he said quietly, and the flower has turned to blood. The air in the room thickened. The brown stone, usually a sanctuary, felt smaller than I'd ever known it. Wolfe sat still as stone, and I realized something I'd seen only twice before. He was angry, not at the crime, but at the intrusion, the sheer insolence of death crossing his threshold uninvited. He opened his eyes again, sharp and bright. Archie, he said, fetch Mrs. Drummond and Mr. Kearns. We will not let the killer finish his play. I intend to close the curtain myself. By the time Mrs. Drummond and Kearns arrived that evening, Wolfe had transformed the office into an amphitheater of tension. The air was tight with that particular stillness he cultivated before striking, a stillness that made you aware of your own breathing. He sat centered behind the desk, massive and unmoving, a mountain disguised in brown silk, while I stationed myself to the left, notebook ready. The manila folder lay open now, its contents spread in neat symmetry across the blotter. I didn't know what Wolfe saw in those pages, but it wasn't the recipes that interested him. It was the pattern. Kearns came in first, the swagger intact, but a little dulled by caution. Mrs. Drummond followed, composed as ever, but pale, her poise brittle. Fritz, obeying a wordless signal, closed the doors behind them and left the room to the 4 of us. Wolfe regarded them without greeting. Please be seated, he said. His voice had that grave resonance that could have commanded confession from marble. They sat. Kearns immediately reached for a cigarette, thought better of it, and let his hand fall. Mrs. Drummond folded hers in her lap, knuckles white. Wolfe began without preface. "You are aware that Joseph Prentice is dead?" Kearns blinked. Mrs. Drummond gasped softly, her composure cracking for the first time. "Dead?" she whispered. "How?" "Violently," Wolfe said. "His body was found this morning in the East River. The police are investigating, of course, though for now the details remain mercifully private. But we know enough. He was struck, weighted, and dropped, and his disappearance followed immediately upon his prank with the file and the flower." Kearns shifted. "So he was your joker. Well, that ends it, doesn't it?" "On the contrary," Wolfe said. "It begins it." He lifted one of the sheets from the folder, holding it delicately between thumb and forefinger. "This, for instance, is a contract between the Culinary Council and your company, Mr. Kearns. It bears your signature and an addendum in another hand, one proposing a clause that benefits you most substantially." Kearns's jaw tightened. "That's standard negotiation." "Not standard forgery," Wolfe said mildly. "I compared this to the copy kept by the council. The addendum does not exist there, nor did Mrs. Drummond authorize it." Mrs. Drummond turned to him sharply. "You forged council documents?" "Now wait a minute," Kearns started, but Wolfe's raised hand froze him. "I do not accuse you of penmanship," Wolfe said. "Not yet. But someone used this forgery to manipulate two egos at once. Mrs. Drummond, you were made to seem careless with confidential files. Mr. Kearns, you were given an incentive to let the matter remain buried. And Prentice, that poor sentimental poet, became the tool who delivered the comedy." Kearns frowned. "You're saying someone else planted the sack at your door to frame me?" "Precisely," Wolfe said. "But who would benefit from tarnishing you, undermining Mrs. Drummond, and offending me all in one stroke?" He let the question hang. Then he leaned forward slightly, a motion so rare it had the force of a blow. "Someone ambitious, someone within reach of all three of us." Mrs. Drummond's hand went to her throat. "Betty," she whispered. "You can't mean Betty." "I do," Wolfe said. She stared at him, stunned. "But why? What could she possibly—" "Because she was humiliated," Wolfe said, his voice low and deliberate. "She was loyal to you, Mrs. Drummond, and you dismissed her contributions as trivial. She was fond of Prentice, who sought significance in verse. Between them they conceived a prank, harmless enough, a jest to unsettle your pompous council, to make the world notice. The file in the flower was his poem, her stagecraft. But then Mr. Kearns entered the picture." Kearns bristled. "Don't drag me into her melodrama." "Oh, but you were already there," Wolfe said. "You visited the bakery a week before the incident, spoke with Miss Ralston privately. You promised her recognition, perhaps employment, if she could deliver the council's files. You underestimated her intelligence. She recognized the manipulation and retaliated. The forged clause was her addition, drawn from your earlier drafts. When Prentice vanished, she understood he had become a liability, and she panicked." Mrs. Drummond whispered. "Then she killed him?" "No," Wolfe said. "She couldn't have. She lacks the nerve for physical cruelty. But she told someone what she and Prentice had done, and that someone acted. The second note, the threat, the murder, that is the work of a professional opportunist, a man who saw blackmail, not mischief." His gaze moved to Kearns like a slow spotlight. "You, Mr. Kearns, had both motive and means. You learned of the prank from Miss Ralston, likely the night Prentice disappeared. You confronted Prentice, struck him, silenced him. Then you sent me that second note to ensure my attention remained divided while you destroyed evidence of your forgery." Kearns' face turned an interesting shade of gray. "That's a fairy tale." Wolfe's tone didn't change. "Indeed. A fairy tale with corroboration. Mr. Panza traced a delivery truck without plates. Yours, borrowed from your warehouse. The timing matches Prentice's last known movements. I have already informed Inspector Kramer. He will confirm the rest." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Kearns's composure cracked cleanly. He rose, half a snarl forming, but I was faster. My hand went to his shoulder and kept him seated. He stayed there, breathing hard, sweat glinting at his temples. Mrs. Drummond stared at him as if seeing a corpse before it hit the river. "Leonard," she said, voice trembling, "you—" He slumped back, defeated. "He was going to ruin me," he muttered. "Run his mouth to the council, make me out a fraud. I just wanted to talk sense into him. He slipped, that's all." Slipped. "Weighted himself down afterward?" I asked dryly. Wolfe exhaled, a long final sound. "Confession by exhaustion," he said. "Typical." The room sagged under the release of tension. Fritz's discreet knock announced Inspector Kramer's arrival, right on Wolfe's timetable. I opened the door, handed over Kearns without ceremony, and closed it again, leaving the world to its legal machinery. Wolfe leaned back, eyes half closed. Pfui! A crude mind, a tempting wit. Flower as camouflage for fraud, verse mistaken for artistry. A dull case, enlivened only by its audacity. Grinned. "You say dull, but I'll bet the newspapers call it the poet's flower murder." He grimaced. "They will, and they will miss the point entirely. The moral, Archie, is simpler. Vanity, like flour, clings to every surface it touches. Remove it too roughly, and the air fills with dust." He reached for his beer. "Now let us dine. I will not have death delaying Fritz's soufflé." And with that, the brownstone began, quietly, to reclaim its peace. Dinner that evening was unusually quiet. Fritz served a veal consommé that could have made a priest forget fasting, but the silence at the table suggested no one was in a mood to appreciate miracles. Wolfe sat massive and motionless, the spoon balanced precisely in his fingers, his expression distant and unreadable. You'd think solving a murder, humiliating a businessman, and rescuing the reputation of his kitchen would have loosened him up. But with Wolfe, satisfaction was never emotional. It was intellectual, and once reached, it often left him deflated, like a balloon that had fulfilled its purpose. I waited until Fritz withdrew with the dishes before I broke the peace. "You know, it's funny," I said. "You spend 2 days piecing together a killer's motive, and the guy hands it to you like a takeout menu. He slipped." That's the shortest confession I've ever heard. Wolfe's eyes opened. Mr. Kearns was not a man of linguistic luxury. He spoke only when the alternatives were worse. "Which, for him, was prison," I said. "Though I'd bet money he still thinks he can buy his way out." He grunted. "He will not. Inspector Kramer, crude though he is, has an unyielding sense of justice. He will pursue the case until it satisfies him, and the evidence," Wolfe tapped his fingers together, "is inescapable." I leaned back. "Then we can finally close the file, both the metaphorical and the literal one." He gave me a look that might have passed for amusement in a dim light. "You are fond of tidy endings, Archie. Life does not offer them. Even victory leaves residue." I smiled. "Residue's fine, as long as it's not flour." That earned me a faint pfui. He reached for his beer. "Still, I will concede a modest relief. My house was invaded, my chef insulted, my name invoked in buffoonery, and the culprit apprehended within 48 hours. Not intolerable." "Not intolerable," I echoed. "That's about as close to pride as you get." "I do not indulge pride," he said, sipping. "Only precision." He returned his glass to the coaster with ritual care, and for a few minutes there was nothing but the ticking of the clock and the low hum of the city outside. Then he said, as if thinking aloud, "The tragedy lies not in Kearns's greed, but in Prentice's folly. A poet without an audience is a dangerous creature." He will mistake any attention for admiration. I nodded. And Betty, Ralston, she will recover, he said. Her involvement was emotional, not venal. She'll be chastened but unharmed. Mrs. Drummond will make a gesture of reconciliation. The Culinary Council will pretend moral superiority, as organizations do when they have none. Sounds like you've got everyone's epilogue written. Observation requires closure, he murmured. Judgment does not. Fritz reappeared with coffee and apple strudel. He served in silence, aware that the house was still absorbing the aftertaste of intrusion. When he withdrew again, Wolfe inhaled deeply, as if reclaiming the sanctity of the room through aroma alone. I poured my coffee and said, "You know, you might have liked Prentice if you'd met him under better circumstances. He had a sort of tragic dignity. The way he wrote those notes, you could tell he wasn't trying to harm anyone at first." "Intentions," Wolfe said, "are a refuge for the self-deceived. He wished to be noticed. He succeeded. It cost him his life. That is the logical consequence of presuming art exempts one from ethics." "Still," I said, "there's a part of me that feels sorry for him." "There is a part of you," Wolfe replied, "that insists on humanizing the guilty. It is your defect and your advantage." "Thanks," I said. "I think." He closed his eyes again, his voice soft but firm. "The world does not require my sympathy, Archie. Only my clarity. Kearns will pay for his crime. Miss Ralston will mourn and mend. Mrs. Drummond will resume her culinary crusade. The brownstone will, in time, return to equilibrium. And you?" He exhaled. "I will resume order. My orchids have been neglected, my schedule disturbed. There is more nourishment in their discipline than in the chaos of human conduct." That was Wolfe in a nutshell. Restore the orchids, ignore the world. He would sit under the glow of those tropical lamps tomorrow, pruning petals with the same care he used to prune falsehoods, and in that ritual he'd find serenity again. I drained the last of my coffee and stood. "Well, boss, if you need me, I'll be in my room pretending to read something educational. If another bag of flour shows up at the door, I'm burning it before you get the chance to philosophize." He didn't open his eyes. "Do not be facetious. Flour is innocent. It was the hands that handled it which were not." I grinned and headed for the hall. Halfway to the stairs, he called after me. "Archie." "Yeah?" "Tomorrow," he said, "send a note to Inspector Kramer. Compliment his efficiency, briefly. It will irritate him." That was Wolfe's idea of entertainment. Weaponized courtesy. I said, "Sure," and turned toward my room. The brownstone had that rare stillness again, the kind that happens only after a storm has passed. The lamps glowed soft gold across the bookshelves, and somewhere in the kitchen Fritz was humming, probably at peace now that no one was defiling his flour. I paused at the door to my room and looked back toward Wolfe's office. Through the crack I could see him sitting as always, immovable, immense, already lost to thought. The case was finished, the house reclaimed, the balance restored. And yet, watching him there, I knew something he'd never admit aloud, that even Nero Wolfe, sovereign of logic and luxury, felt the faint sting of human waste when brilliance turned to folly and laughter to death. But that, as he'd say, was not his concern. The world would keep baking its chaos, and Wolfe would keep sifting it, grain by grain, until only truth remained. I closed the door quietly, leaving him to his silence and his orchids, while outside the city's noise began to rise again, life continuing, as always, indifferent to the dust it left behind. The next morning came with a sort of uneasy quiet that doesn't mean peace. It means something in the air hasn't finished with you yet. The city outside the brownstone was half awake, wheels and horns murmuring under a low sky, and I found myself listening for the usual morning sounds. Fritz setting the coffee pot on the stove, the rustle of Wolfe's slippers overhead, the creak of the elevator returning him from his orchid sanctum. Everything was there, but just slightly out of rhythm, as though the house was still remembering that a man had died because of a file wrapped in flour. When Wolfe entered the office, he did it without the usual preamble of sighs and complaints about the newspaper headlines. He took his seat, pressed his palms flat on the desk, and regarded me with the look that means my day's about to fill up. "Archie," he said, "I have a letter to dictate." That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the tone, deliberate but heavier, as if each word had been rolled in lead before reaching the air. "To Mrs. Laura Drummond," he continued. "Madame, I am satisfied that the culpability for Mr. Kern's deception and the tragic consequence of Joseph Prentice's death has been resolved. However, I urge the Culinary Council to reflect upon the atmosphere it cultivated, an environment where ambition and insecurity were allowed to ferment into folly. Yours sincerely, Nero Wolfe." I typed it, knowing he'd sign it but never mail it. Wolfe's moral observations usually stayed in the drawer, filed under principles, for private use only. When I slid the paper over for his signature, he reached for the pen, hesitated, then set it down again. "Archie, what did you think of Miss Ralston?" "Honestly? The kind who'll carry guilt around like an accessory, visible but tidy. She'll recover, but she'll never bake another cake without hearing the word forgery somewhere in the back of her head." "An apt diagnosis," he murmured. "We are poor physicians, you and I. We mend reason, not hearts." "That's because hearts don't pay. Retainers." He ignored that, reaching for the morning mail. There was a thin envelope among the bills addressed in tight, looping script to Mr. Nero Wolfe, 35th Street, New York. No return address. He slit it with his thumb, unfolded the single sheet, and read silently. Then he passed it to me. The note was brief. He didn't write the last poem. I stared at it. What's that supposed to mean? Kearns's confession covered everything. "It covered his crime," Wolfe said. "But it may not have covered his accomplices." He leaned back, steepling his fingers, the old gleam returning to his eyes, the one that meant he'd found a pebble on the path, and was certain it wasn't just a pebble. "Archie, call Inspector Kramer. Tell him I require the envelope from the river recovery, the one containing the original poem found on Prentice's person." "You think there was one?" "I know there was. Kearns never had the imagination to mimic verse convincingly. That final note, the threat, was crude, but Prentice's style was measured, symbolic. Someone forged the second, and perhaps the first. Someone who wanted both me and Kearns occupied while they concluded other business. I felt that little tingle that comes when Wolfe starts talking like the case isn't finished after all. "You're saying there's another player in the act?" "I am saying," Wolfe replied, "that the curtain fell too soon." Kramer arrived that afternoon, reeking of cigar smoke and suspicion. He threw his hat onto the rack and gave me the look he saves for when he suspects Wolfe's wasting his time again. "You've already got your confession, Wolfe. Kearns'll hang himself without your help." Wolfe gestured toward the chair. "Perhaps. But humor me, Inspector." "The envelope?" Kramer grunted, reached into his coat and produced a plastic sleeve with a small, water-stained scrap of paper. "This was in Prentice's jacket pocket. We figured it was one of his poems. The lab boys couldn't make much sense of it." He passed it over. The pencil marks were faint but legible enough for Wolfe to study. He adjusted his spectacles and read aloud. "The hand that feeds will never need. The oven hums for those who lead." He laid it down gently. "Not Prentice," he said. "The syntax is too literal, the imagery too pointed. Someone mimicked his style to frame an interpretation to suggest that Prentice sought vengeance on authority figures." "Meaning?" Kramer demanded. "Meaning Miss Ralston didn't merely assist him," Wolfe said. "She finished his work, and after Kearns disposed of Prentice, she exploited his death to polish her own exoneration. The anonymous note this morning, he didn't write the last poem, came from her conscience or her fear, possibly both." Kramer groaned. For the love of Wolfe, you're dragging me back into a case that's already closed. It is closed, Wolfe said calmly. But truth is not confined by paperwork. If you wish to confirm it, have your men check the fingerprints on the paper found in Prentice's pocket. They will find Miss Ralston's delicately placed, as though arranging flowers. Kramer scowled. If you're wrong, I am never wrong about fingerprints, Wolfe said, reaching for his beer. Kramer muttered something unprintable and left. I followed him to the door, trying not to grin. When I came back, Wolfe was leaning back again, eyes closed, face composed in what looked almost like serenity. You're sure she did it? I asked. She orchestrated it, he said. She wrote the first note to impress Prentice, the second to implicate Kearns, and the final one this morning to absolve herself. Each line was a different attempt at redemption. A pity she had talent, but no moral compass. He lifted his glass, regarding the amber swirl before taking a slow sip. Poets, he said finally, should never meddle in prose. The rhythm of deceit always stumbles. Later, when the night settled and the brownstone had exhaled its day's tension, I found the quiet creeping back. Not the tense kind, but the earned kind. Wolfe was upstairs again, among his orchids, and the kitchen smelled of Fritz's evening preparations. I poured myself a drink, sat in the office where it had all begun, and looked at the clean blotter on the desk. Wolfe was right. Tidy endings were for fairy tales. Real life left traces, fingerprints invisible under light, flour that never quite washed away. But in this house, at least, order was restored, and for tonight that was enough. It was nearly midnight when Kramer called back. The sound of his voice was like gravel in a coffee grinder, but this time there was something different underneath the irritation, something that sounded almost like respect. You were right, Wolfe, he said without preamble. Fingerprints on the note matched the girl's. Betty Ralston, she broke about an hour ago, said she couldn't stand the silence. Claimed she wrote the poems to give the story meaning, whatever that's supposed to mean. She will attempt poetry, even in confession, Wolfe said, not looking up from his book. It is consistent. Kramer snorted. You could have just told me that 2 days ago and saved me a headache. I could have, Wolfe agreed. But then you'd have missed the satisfaction of discovery. There was a muttered curse, and the line went dead. Wolfe set the receiver down as if it had ceased to exist. That was how it always ended with Kramer. Frustration for him, equilibrium for Wolfe, and a quiet sense of completion for me. I leaned against the desk and studied him. So that's that. Betty Ralston writes poetry, kills no one, but manages to make accomplices of both a murderer and a dead man. That's a talent. She did not kill, Wolfe said, but she authored chaos. She sowed words without discipline and reaped ruin. Her verse, like her conscience, lacked structure. He lifted his eyes from the page and regarded me evenly. It is an ancient truth, Archie. Language without measure invites disaster. Maybe. But she didn't mean to start a war. She just wanted someone to listen. Then she chose a poor audience. He gestured at the room, the ordered books, the polished wood, the world in miniature that existed under his control. Here, I allow only clarity. Sentiment is an intruder. I smiled. You'd throw it out with the morning trash. Promptly, he said, and returned to his reading. That was my cue. I went to the window, looked out at the city blinking and restless below. The kind of night that keeps everyone half awake, taxi lights moving like fireflies, the hum of distant trains, the life Wolfe never touches, but somehow always understands. The case had begun with flour and ended with ink, but what it had really been about was vanity. Artistic, professional, moral. Everyone in it wanted to be seen, to prove they mattered, even if it meant stepping on someone else's stage. Behind me, Wolfe's voice rumbled softly. "It is curious," he said, "how easily men and women mistake attention for esteem. The world is filled with people clamoring to be noticed, and they call that living. Mr. Kearns wanted acclaim, Miss Ralston wanted sympathy, Prentice wanted immortality. Each received what they desired, only in the form least expected." "Justice," I said. "Balance," he corrected. "Justice is a human word. Balance belongs to nature." He closed his book, signaling the end of the day's discourse. "Fritz has prepared chamomile. Bring me a cup before you retire." "Yes, sir," I said, moving toward the kitchen. When I came back with the tray, he was still in his chair, the light behind him throwing a calm, golden outline across his shoulders. I placed the cup beside him, and he nodded once, absently. "Archie," he said, "instruct Fritz that tomorrow's menu shall include brioche. I find I have no objection to flour again." That was Wolfe's version of humor, dry, understated, and final. I left him to his tea and went to my room, where the silence of the house felt like something earned. The investigation was over, but its dust still lingered. A thin layer of what Wolfe would call residue. Somewhere, Betty Ralston was sitting in a cell, reciting poetry to walls that wouldn't applaud. Somewhere else, Kramer was writing his report, grumbling about Wolfe's arrogance while secretly respecting it. And here, in this brownstone fortress, Nero Wolfe sat among his orchids, restoring symmetry to the world one thought at a time. I stretched out on the bed, replaying the week in my head, the flower on the stoop, the sack that had started it all, the first note that turned a kitchen prank into a confession of the human condition. The case had been less about crime than about pride, less about deception than about how far people go to matter. And Wolfe, as usual, had seen through it all, dissecting vanity with the same patience he used for a soufflé recipe. Before I drifted off, I heard him moving faintly above. His heavy steps on the landing, the sound of the elevator gate sliding open as he ascended to the orchids. His nightly retreat, his kingdom in bloom. It struck me then that his orchids were the only creatures he truly trusted, quiet, obedient, unpretentious in their beauty. The world outside would keep spinning its tales of ambition and folly, but here in the brownstone, the rhythm was steady again. The file was back where it belonged, the kitchen sanctified, and the master of deduction restored to his domain. As for me, I'd type the report in the morning, make a clean copy for the records, and probably never see Mrs. Drummond again except in the society pages. But for tonight, I let the city's hum fade to nothing, and the scent of Fritz's coffee drift through the walls, knowing that Nero Wolfe would be content once more, at least until the next disturbance dared to knock on our door. And when it did, I'd be there to open it, notebook in hand, ready to watch him rebuild order from chaos all over again. Because that's what we do in this house on 35th Street. The world sends us its foolishness, and we send it back polished, like a diamond cut from dust.